Hello and welcome to the Nutrition Diva podcast, a show where we take a closer look at nutrition news, research, and trends so that you can make more informed decisions about what you eat. I'm your host, Monica Reinagel, and having now been in the business and on this beat for almost 20 years, one of the things that I've noticed is the cyclical nature of certain nutrition concerns and the misinformation that often accompanies them. For example, early on in my time doing this podcast, I dedicated several episodes to high fructose corn syrup. And then this particular concern seemed to fade a bit from the public consciousness. But now recent events have revived the conversation about banning high fructose corn syrup from the food supply. And some of the arguments for this position are not based in scientific fact. So I thought I'd take this opportunity to revisit this topic and clarify some of the most common misperceptions. When you are cooking or baking at home and your recipe calls for sugar, you will probably use what's known as table sugar, and that comes from either sugarcane or beets. But regardless of the source, table sugar is sucrose. This is a 2-sugar molecule, or a disaccharide, and it's made up of 1 molecule of glucose joined with 1 molecule of fructose. Now, food manufacturers, on the other hand, are more likely to use high fructose corn syrup than they are to use cane or beet sugar, table sugar, primarily because high fructose corn syrup is a lot cheaper. Now, high fructose corn syrup has sometimes been blamed for fueling a dramatic rise in obesity and type 2 diabetes, largely because the widespread adoption of high fructose corn syrup in food manufacturing largely coincided with a rise in those disease rates. Of course, this is merely a correlation. However, this argument was bolstered by the observation that a high intake of fructose can lead to the accumulation of liver fats and other metabolic damage, which could contribute to obesity or type 2 diabetes. You see, fructose is metabolized a little differently than other sugars. Unlike glucose, which is converted into energy in the cells, fructose is metabolized in the liver. And if you overload the liver with a whole bunch of fructose, that could indeed lead to all kinds of problems. But the name high fructose corn syrup can be misleading. Many people believe, for example, that it is much higher in fructose than regular table sugar, but this is not the case. Corn syrup is naturally quite low in fructose. So the corn syrup that you buy at the grocery store, for example, typically contains less than 1% fructose. The rest is all glucose. And for that reason, unaltered corn syrup would be a very bad substitute for cane sugar. For one thing, corn syrup isn't nearly as sweet tasting as table sugar because glucose doesn't taste as sweet as fructose does. So in order to make corn syrup into an acceptable replacement for cane sugar, manufacturers developed an enzymatic process that converts some of that glucose in corn syrup into fructose, making it more similar to table sugar. Table sugar, you'll remember, is 50% fructose. High fructose corn syrup, on the other hand, ranges from 42 to 55% fructose. It's essentially equivalent. But that name, high fructose corn syrup, continues to confuse people. Some have also suggested that the free fructose in high fructose corn syrup is more rapidly absorbed than the bound fructose in table sugar. But any slight difference in absorption speed is unlikely to matter, and the total amount of fructose reaching the liver remains exactly the same. To the extent that anyone's liver is being overloaded by excessive fructose, it is likely due to the amount of added sugars we are consuming and not the form or the type of added sugar we're consuming. In researching this podcast episode, I was surprised at how much misinformation is still out there. For example, one article on a very highly regarded outlet stated that studies show that high fructose corn syrup increases your appetite and promotes obesity more than regular sugar. However, the studies that they were referring to were comparing pure fructose to pure glucose, not comparing high fructose corn syrup to table sugar. And outside of a laboratory experiment, you are very unlikely to ever be consuming pure fructose, or for that matter, pure glucose. And consuming them together alters their absorption and their metabolism. Here's the thing that people don't seem to get. Replacing all of the high fructose corn syrup in the food supply with cane sugar is not going to meaningfully reduce the amount of fructose in the food supply. Both cane sugar and high fructose corn syrup contain similar amounts of fructose, and the body processes them in comparable ways. Now, if we were to replace high fructose corn syrup with cane sugar, it would make sweetened foods and beverages more expensive. And that, I suppose, could theoretically reduce consumption. There is limited evidence that things like soda taxes, which attempt to make sugar-sweetened beverages less appealing by making them more expensive, do reduce the sale of these products. On the other hand, when those kinds of taxes are imposed, it appears that people often will just switch to other types of beverages that are not included in the policy, with little net reduction in their sugar or their calorie intake, or for that matter, on obesity rates. So I'm not convinced that a high fructose corn syrup ban makes sense as a health policy move. Nor, for that matter, would it seem to be consonant with the health freedoms that many advocates of this very policy say that they would value. But the larger point that I want to make is that high fructose corn syrup is not a uniquely dangerous form of sugar. It is not meaningfully higher in fructose than table sugar. Agave nectar, on the other hand, which is widely perceived to be a much healthier option, is way higher in fructose than either sugar or high fructose corn syrup, at about 90% fructose. But look, if you're concerned about your liver, your metabolic health, your obesity risks, my best advice is to simply keep your intake of all added sugars, and that includes table sugar and high fructose corn syrup, but also honey, agave nectar, coconut sugar, maple syrup. Keep all of those added sugars to within the recommended limits. And if you're following those guidelines, it really makes very little difference whether the added sugars in your diet are coming from cane sugar, high fructose corn syrup, agave, honey, or any other source. Okay, so what are those guidelines again? Well, the Dietary Guidelines for Americans, along with the World Health Organization, recommends limiting your added sugars to no more than 10% of your daily calories. For a 2,000 calorie diet, this would equate to no more than 200 calories or about 50 grams, and that is the equivalent of 12 teaspoons of added sugar per day. Now, for what it's worth, the American Heart Association recommends stricter limits. They suggest that women should consume no more than 100 calories, about 25 grams or 6 teaspoons of added sugar per day, and men no more than 150 calories. That's about 38 grams or 9 teaspoons a day. Now, to be clear, these recommended limits do not include the naturally occurring sugars that you would get from whole fruits and vegetables and unsweetened dairy products. So you can check the nutrition facts labels to see how much added sugar is in packaged foods, but I can probably save you a little time here. The biggest source of added sugars in the American diet are sodas and other sweetened beverages, like sweetened iced tea or even energy drinks. A single 12-ounce can of regular soda contains about 39 grams of added sugar. That was the limit for men. The next biggest source are sweets and desserts, so you want to enjoy those in moderation and be mindful of your portion sizes. It's definitely worth keeping an eye on your added sugar consumption, but in my opinion, spending a lot of time, money, or energy to find or legislate products that are made with cane sugar instead of high fructose corn syrup is unlikely to yield much, if any, benefit. If you have a nutrition question you'd like me to answer, you can email it to me at nutrition@quickanddirtytips.com. You can also leave me a voicemail at 443-961-6206. Nutrition Diva is a Quick and Dirty Tips podcast. Our team includes Brandon Getchis, Nathan Sems, Davina Tomlin, Holly Hutchings, Morgan Christensen, and Nate Hoops. If you're interested in finding out more about having me speak at your workplace or at your next live or virtual event, you can find out more on my website at wellnessworkshere.com. That's it for me today. Thanks so much for listening. I'll see you next week.